The ruins survived. The instructions did not. That may be the cleanest way to describe one of the biggest losses in African history, because ancient Africa did not just build kingdoms, monuments, and trade empires. It also built technologies, real technologies, materials science, engineering, timekeeping, metallurgy, urban construction, practical systems that solved real problems for real people. And then somewhere along the way, much of that story was pushed out of the spotlight, not erased completely, just dimmed. The world remembered the statues and forgot the chemistry. It remembered the ruins and forgot the engineering. It remembered the gold and forgot the machines behind power. So today we're going to pull that story back into view, not fantasy, not Atlantis, not internet myth. Real ancient African technologies that were replaced, obscured, or simply undertaught. And once you see them together, the old picture of history starts to fall apart. Because ancient Africa was not just consuming knowledge, it was making it. Let's start with something almost everyone has touched indirectly, but almost nobody credits properly. Before paper became ordinary, ancient Egyptians had already developed an astonishingly effective writing material from the papyrus plant. They cut the pith into strips, layered them, pressed them, dried them, and turned reeds from the Nile into a writing surface strong enough to carry contracts, letters, religious texts, and state records. The earliest known papyrus roll dates to around 290 BCE, and the earliest surviving written examples are from around 250 BCE. For centuries, papyrus was the dominant writing material of Egypt and spread into the Greek and Roman worlds. It only began to be seriously displaced by parchment and then paper, becoming largely unnecessary in Egypt by the 8th and 9th centuries CE, though some use lasted much longer. Now pause there. A civilization that can mass-produce knowledge is not primitive. A civilization that can turn a river plant into the main writing material of an empire is not waiting for literacy to arrive from somewhere else. That is technology, and it is easy to miss how revolutionary it was because paper feels normal to us now. But in the ancient world, this was infrastructure for memory. Without a reliable writing surface, states become fragile. Laws fade, records disappear. Medicine, mathematics, religion, administration, they all become harder to transmit. Papyrus was not just a material. It was a storage device for civilization. And that is only the beginning. Because ancient Egypt did something else that feels almost unbelievable once you hear it. It manufactured one of the world's earliest synthetic pigments. Not a lucky natural stone. Not just ground-up minerals scraped from the earth. Manufactured. Egyptian blue was made by combining silica or quartz, a calcium source, copper, and a flux, then heating the mixture to very high temperatures. Modern museum and conservation sources describe it as the first synthetic pigment. Evidence suggests Egyptians were making and using it as early as the late 4th millennium BCE, and it remained in use into the Greco-Roman period. Think about what that means. This is not just art. This is controlled heat, material transformation, recipe knowledge, and repeatable production. In plain language, it is chemistry, and for a long time the method faded from common use. That is what makes it feel so haunting. People could still see the color, but not everyone still knew how it had been made. The pigment survived longer than the public memory of the process, and that pattern repeats again and again with ancient African technologies. The object survives. The prestige survives. The name sometimes survives, but the technical genius underneath it gets blurred out. Now let's shift from materials to time, because ancient Africans were not just making surfaces and pigments. They were trying to measure the night. Long before mechanical clocks took over, ancient Egyptians were already using water clocks to measure time when sundials failed at night or under cloud. A modern history review notes that a 16th century BCE Egyptian court official even claimed credit for inventing them. And surviving examples from ancient Egypt date back to the 14th century BCE. These clocks became sophisticated enough that later cultures adopted and refined the idea, and water clocks remained state-of-the-art timekeepers for centuries. According to that same review, they were only truly made obsolete after Christian Huygens introduced the pendulum clock in 1656. That is an enormous span of influence. And it matters because timekeeping is power. Temples need it. Administrators need it. Astronomy needs it. Ritual needs it. Agriculture needs it. Once a society starts measuring time more precisely, it starts disciplining daily life differently. Schedules become sharper. Ceremonies become standardized. Observation becomes more exact. So when people talk about ancient African science like it was vague or mystical, technologies like water clocks make that stereotype look ridiculous. This was measurement. This was design. This was precision under ancient conditions. And then we move south into a technology that feels hotter, louder, and more industrial. Because ancient Kush was not only building monuments, it was transforming ore into iron on a massive scale. At Meroitic, in what is now Sudan, the archaeological record shows extensive iron production. Britannica describes Meroitic as an early industrial site with huge slag heaps and furnaces, while UNESCO identifies the ironworks and industrial zones of the island of Meroitic as part of what shaped the technological scene of the Middle and Northern Nile Valley for more than 1,000 years. A Cambridge-hosted archaeology paper notes that from the 3rd century BCE to the 4th century CE, Kushite rulers controlled significant territory, in part through their ability to ensure large-scale iron production. Now stop and picture that: furnaces burning, bellows pumping, ore turning into workable iron. Slag piling up around an African city that many people still barely know. This is one of the reasons Meroitic matters so much. It forces us to stop imagining ancient Africa as passive and rural in some simplistic sense. Meroitic had industrial landscapes. It had production zones. It had metallurgy tied directly to state power. Iron is never just iron. Iron becomes blades, tools, agriculture, authority, and war. When a kingdom masters metalworking at scale, it changes everything around it. And yet ask the average person about ancient industrial sites, and Meroitic is rarely one of the first names mentioned. That silence is part of the story too. Because once Africa enters the story of early industry, the old hierarchy of civilization gets harder to maintain. And now for a technology people often stare at without fully recognizing. Not a machine, not a pigment, not a writing material, a building system and an engineering logic. Great Zimbabwe, active roughly from the 11th to the 15th centuries, was built by ancestors of the Shona people. The Metropolitan Museum of Art describes the site's monumental structures as dry stone masonry, carefully layered stone construction without mortar. Britannica notes that the builders formed walls from granite blocks reaching up to 36 feet high and 20 feet thick in places. After the 15th century, Great Zimbabwe was gradually abandoned, but the stone-working tradition did not simply vanish. Britannica says those techniques seem to have transferred southward to Kami. This is where technology gets too narrow if we only think about gadgets. Because architecture is technology, construction is technology, load-bearing knowledge is technology. To raise enormous walls without mortar and have them endure for centuries requires planning, material intelligence, labor organization, and inherited expertise. It is not random stacking. It is a system. And maybe that is why Great Zimbabwe still hits so hard. Even now, the walls argue back. They stand there and quietly destroy the lie that complex engineering belonged somewhere else. And that really is the thread tying all of this together. Papyrus, Egyptian blue, water clocks, Meroitic iron furnaces, and Great Zimbabwe's masonry. Different regions, different centuries, different needs. But all of them prove the same thing. Ancient Africa was not technologically empty. It was experimenting, measuring, refining, building, manufacturing, and scaling. Some of these technologies were replaced by newer systems. Some faded with political collapse. Some survived only in fragments. Some lasted so long that people stopped noticing how extraordinary they were in the first place. But none of that makes them less important. If anything, it makes them more important. Because the first thing history often loses is not the object, it is the credit. And once credit disappears, imagination follows. People stop asking what Africans invented. They start assuming innovation came from somewhere else. They inherit a map where Africa receives technology but does not generate it. That is the real loss. Not only the technique, the memory of the technique. So when you hear the phrase lost technologies of ancient Africa, do not picture magic. Picture workshops, furnaces, scribes, pigment makers, engineers, builders, and timekeepers. Picture people solving hard problems with the tools they had and doing it well enough that traces of their work still survive thousands of years later. Because once you see that clearly, ancient Africa stops looking like a blank space in the history of invention. It starts looking like what it really was, a maker of technologies the world still does not talk about enough. Subscribe to Ancient Africa Explained for more videos like this, turn on notification bell, and let me know the area you would like me to cover on my next video.